pretty late at night. I did turn the big light on for you, but not as bright. Zeno's paradox is a really ancient paradox that you've probably heard of. Quantum mechanics is a relatively new science that you've probably heard of. You can solve one with the other. This isn't like new. I'm not making this up. It's sort of a fun thing that is worth explaining. And the reason I'm explaining it is because if you saw my last video, I was feeling a little bit like there was this line that I was having difficulty crossing from James Madison's concepts of domestic faction based on what I would call like an animalistic or an emotional perspective, and then this one. This right here I would consider to be the epistemic derivation of the need for democratic pluralism. That was a lot of words. But I promise this time that you'll know what I mean. And we're going to get there by solving Zeno's paradox using Heisenberg uncertainty principle that says, yes, actually, we're actually going to do that. Zeno's paradox is this wonky thought experiment that was brought about by Zeno, who is a contemporary of either Socrates or Plato. I never can remember. And you've probably heard of it before, but let me give you a doodle. Okay, so it's like 450, 490-ish BC, and there's this guy who's making an argument that there is no motion, nothing moves, because that which is moving must reach the midpoint before the end. You will see some scribbles from my undergraduate self in like the year 2011. This is because you can solve this answer by inventing calculus. That's one of the ways that you can solve the paradox, but that hadn't been done yet in 450 BC. It's not too difficult to understand. The claim is that there is no such thing as motion. To get from A to B, he argues, you have to first go, halfway. And like a toddler asking why, or what next, just infinitely asking the same question until there are literally no answers anymore, says, well, in order to get to halfway, we just proved that to get from one place to another, you have to be able to go halfway. So you can't get to halfway without first going to halfway. You see where I'm going with this. You can't get to half of half without half of half of half of half, without half of half of half. Therefore, motion does not exist. But obviously motion does exist, hence the name Zeno's paradox. Now you might be thinking this is a stupid problem and it has nothing to do with real life. I don't blame you for thinking that. I promise that I will explain that it actually does connect to literally something that was written in 1787 at the foundation of our democracy. You also might think that it's weird to be thinking in these geometric terms and analyzing life, but remember the Pythagorean theorem? That's named after Pythagoras, who's in this era. The vibe is geometry right now. Sidebar to the sidebar, Parmenides kind of seems like he derived the ontological argument for the existence of God and or some sort of proto-concept of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Thousands of years ago. A lot of these things that we think are new have been happening and other people have thought them. It's part of why I started reading Plato's Republic, because Plato witnessed the downfall of his democracy and it affected his perspective on the world. Anyway, how do we solve Zeno's paradox? Well, as is often the case, you don't solve paradoxes so much as dissolve paradoxes. We know that something is wrong about this reasoning because we know that motion exists. So part of our job is to figure out what went wrong in this reasoning. So as I was reading this book, The Rigor of Angels, which I'm really not sure that I recommend, we'll save that discussion for later. The author explains that Heisenberg uncertainty principle dissolves Zeno's paradox because space is not infinitely divisible. Let's break that down. It's actually pretty quick. Let me translate this into words. This right here, this term represents the uncertainty in position, and this term represents the uncertainty in momentum. This is Planck's constant divided by 4 pi for our purposes. It's a really, really teensy tiny number. Imagine the smallest atom, a hydrogen atom, and then imagine that it had like tiny peach fuzz hairs on the outside, and then zoom into the hair, and then every little hair has a hair on the outside. It would be smaller than those hairs on the peach fuzz of a hydrogen atom. It's a really small distance. But recall that Zeno's paradox requires us to be able to divide things infinitely many times. You probably heard John Green say that not all infinities are the same size. That's true, but no infinity is the size of 0. Even the tiniest peach fuzz hair on the peach fuzz hair of a hydrogen atom looks massive compared to nothing, compared to infinitely small. To relate these two together, as soon as you divide something in half, you decrease your uncertainty. You're more certain that, let's say it's a turtle, you're more certain that the turtle is in this region. Your uncertainty in position is going to be whatever that distance is. You divide it in half again, you're going to get an even smaller uncertainty. You keep going and going and going, and you get so precise in your certainty about the position that Heisenberg uncertainty principle says that your uncertainty in momentum explodes to infinity. I don't know where you're at in your science journey, but one way to understand this is that space cannot be infinitely divided. That's one of the insights of Planck's constant, the Planck length you might have heard in other contexts. If space cannot be infinitely divided, then we're not actually able to do this reasoning. We're not able to cut half and half and half and half and half and half and half. It's just not possible, and we've dissolved the paradox. If there are any philosophers of physics watching, I know that you can't derive the Planck length from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's a pedagogical choice. It's hand-wavy. There's only so much time in the world. Another way to say this is that you can't have infinite precision. You can't know everything about two coupled variables. It's just physically impossible. A different way to say this is that you can only know so much with your limited perspective on the world. So we have did it, that says dissolved. We have dissolved Zeno's paradox using the uncertainty principle from quantum mechanics. But we're not done, because we can finally connect it to the real world, specifically the in vitro fertilization ban that was predicted in Federalist Paper number 2. Obviously, that is a ridiculous claim that is completely pulled out of nowhere, except it's not pulled out of nowhere. I totally derived it in the last video. We talked about it. There was a problem, though, which we're getting to in this video. The fancy phrase that I said at the beginning of the video was the epistemic derivation of democratic pluralism. If you didn't see my previous video, I guess a super short version is that democratic pluralism is the opposite of domestic faction and insurrection. Pluralism is what we need to survive us fighting each other in angry factions. It's not me or my insight. That's the insight of actually James Madison, who actually wrote the Constitution in Federalist Paper number 10. And when I showed you that mind map with the 3 quotes, I skipped part of the 3rd quote. Now we're going to get to it. Madison keeps talking about factions, and he says in these quotes, which I explained in the other video, so I'm not going to redo it here. He says that it's a permanent part of human nature, and our reasoning is imperfect. Let's finally wrap it all together, put it all together, tie it with a bow. Home stretch. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. Let me exaggerate that a little so that we can translate it out of English and into English. Human reasoning is limited. It's fallible. You can only know so much about the world. We all want things. We all have longings. We all have passions. And as he says in the other quotes, these things are permanently baked into the human condition. So James Madison, author of the Constitution, founder of the country, says that human reasoning is limited. Human desires are selfish. There will always be differences. There will always be factions. There will always be conflict if we cannot have a society of democratic pluralism, a society of tolerance. We cannot have a society. Tolerance isn't wokeness. It is the necessary prerequisite for a functioning democratic republic.